Did Theodore Roosevelt say the art of jiu-jitsu is worth more in every way than all of our athletic pursuits combined? Hey y'all, I'm Jeff Shaw. I teach at Western Washington University and I'm teaching a class about martial arts history. I want to talk about this and some other quotes about judo and jiu-jitsu in America around the turn of the last century. This is a really prominent quote and you'll see it a lot of different places all over the internet, and some jiu-jitsu schools even have it hanging in their academies. Roosevelt did love jiu-jitsu and he did love judo, and he said a lot of great things about both. He called John O'Brien's jiu-jitsu lessons marvelous, even though he said it was difficult to learn. Said a ton of great things about Yoshiaki Yamashita and all of the amazing lessons he learned from him. In fact, a bunch of my judo friends point out if you see a quote from Roosevelt of the period talking about jiu-jitsu, there's a pretty good chance he's talking about judo instead, even though he said great things about both. However, in this case, I think my judo friends are mistaken. Not because Roosevelt was talking about jiu-jitsu, but because he probably didn't say this quote at all. If you Google it, you're going to find a bunch of people quoting him as saying it. Even AI thinks he said it. Influential podcasters, legends of jiu-jitsu, prominent school owners, a bunch of folks who have written blogs all quote Roosevelt as saying this. So why don't I think he said it? There are three primary reasons, with the third being the most important. The first is that all of these sources, although they're everywhere, none of them are primary sources. And so if you go to a place that quotes Roosevelt as saying this, they will quote someone else who is a secondary source, who will quote someone else who is a secondary source. And this is kind of a telltale sign. The second reason, which caused me to investigate this question, is it just didn't sound like him. I did a ton of research on Roosevelt, reading every newspaper article where he talked about jiu-jitsu, and it just sounded off to me. One of the reasons it sounded off is Roosevelt was really patriotic, and you can imagine him saying amazing things about jiu-jitsu and judo, which he did, but would he really say they are worth more than all of American athletics put together? Doesn't sound like something the American president would say. So if he didn't say it, where did the quote come from, and who did say it? And we're back to this guy, Irving Hancock. I made a video on him before and we'll definitely talk about him again because he was one of the most prolific writers about jiu-jitsu from 1900 to 1906. He wrote 4 books on the topic, even though he probably never trained jiu-jitsu at all. Hancock might never have trained martial arts, but he had books to sell and he was good at it. During this period, we see dozens of newspaper articles either quoting Hancock or excerpting his book or excerpting some of his magazine articles, and a lot of them start to use this phrase, worth more in every way than all of our athletic sports combined. Do you notice that it says jiu-jitsu has its most distinguished American exponent in the president? So it's Hancock ostensibly quoting Roosevelt. So Hancock is almost definitely the original source of this quote. If you're bummed out that we're going to lose a quote from an iconic president that praises jiu-jitsu, don't worry, I'll give you an alternative at the end of this video that the president actually said. Now you might be asking, how do we know that Hancock wasn't quoting Roosevelt accurately? 2 reasons. First, there's no evidence they ever met. And second, there's a bunch of evidence that Hancock just made things up. There's a lot of claims in his articles and books about the teachings of Jigoro Kano, who he definitely never met. And how do we know that? If you watched one of the other Hancock videos, you might remember that Hancock teamed up with jiu-jitsu practitioner Katsuguma Higashi to write a book that purported to reveal the complete Jigoro Kano jiu-jitsu judo system. There was just one problem. Neither of those guys had ever met Jigoro Kano or trained at the Kodokan, and so a couple of decades later, when the man himself was traveling to Germany, he saw a copy of the book and wrote an article that was appended to the English edition that said, hey, this is not my judo, this is old school Japanese jiu-jitsu that's almost extinct in Japan today. So we know that they were playing fast and loose with the facts. If you start to look through archives, you see tons of newspaper articles, magazine stories that all use this same phrase, worth more in every way than all of our athletic sports combined. They're always attributed to the president, but the original source is always Hancock, his book, an article, or some kind of excerpt from something he's written. This happens commonly with quotations from famous people. Someone says someone said something, someone else repeats it, and before long, especially if it seems plausible that they might have said it, it's just out there as being true. You can especially get in trouble with quotes about Roosevelt around this time, because sometimes he's talking about jiu-jitsu, which Sean O'Brien is teaching him. Sometimes he's talking about judo, which Yoshiaki Yamashita is teaching him, and the American press isn't really making a distinction between the two. So surely somewhere there's a quote we can use that kind of avoids both problems? I got good news for you, there is. I suggest this quote from Robert Johnstone Mooney. We talked in a previous video about how Mooney and his brother went to the White House to spar boxing with the president, but after they got done boxing, the president said, hey, do you guys know about jiu-jitsu? Because you're so good in other athletics, you must add jiu-jitsu to your other accomplishments. Every American athlete ought to understand the Japanese system thoroughly. You can quote that, talks about everything. If you're a judo guy, you can just clip the part that calls it the Japanese system. And by the way, because it's 1904, he is probably talking about judo here.